Hey guys, welcome to the channel. If you're new here, I do weekly uploads on some of the most horrendous and mysterious cases around the world. So if you're a true crime fan like I am, please make sure to hit that subscribe button. Before we get started today, I do want to take a quick second to give you guys a speculation warning, because although I have tried to weed out the opinions and only use factual information, we have to be mindful that this is still the internet, and even if you may think so, not everything you see is 100% true. Alright, now that we got the boring stuff out of the way, let's take a trip to Seattle, Washington. Shall we? Seattle is Washington's largest city with a population of around 750,000 people, and it is home to some of the largest tech companies in the industry, including Amazon and Microsoft headquarters. Claiming to have murdered as many as 80 women, I introduce to you the one, the only, Gary Ridgway, aka the Green River Killer.
In Seattle this morning, police are hunting a mass murderer believed to have killed as many as 21 prostitutes in the last 22 months.
In this video, we will mainly go over a timeline covering all of his horrific acts and what ultimately led to him getting caught almost 2 decades later. Before we get into the timeline, I want to give you guys somewhat of a backstory. So for starters, Gary was America's deadliest convicted serial killer when in 2003, he pleaded guilty to 48 counts of murder. Gary didn't have the best upbringing by any means. His mother, Mary, was very, very abusive toward everyone in the household, including her husband, Thomas.
What did you want to do to your mom here?
I wanted her to stop being angry at me for not knowing how to...
But she wasn't stopping.
No, she wasn't stopping.
Was she?
No.
She kept picking at you. Belittling you, embarrassing you. I mean, that was pretty clear from yesterday.
Just to give you guys an example, Gary said that there was a couple of occasions where she broke a glass plate over Thomas's head. Now, because Thomas worked as a bus driver, Gary would often hear him complaining about all of the prostitutes he would see on his route, and honestly, I feel like that played a big part in why every woman that Gary murdered was a prostitute or a runaway. Gary said that when he was a child, and really even into his teenage years, he would often wet the bed, and because of this, it gave his mother all the ammunition to embarrass him, and by embarrassing him, I mean she would announce it to the whole family when he would do it, and also she would put him in the bath immediately so that she could wash his genitals for him as a sign of belittlement. Obviously, you guys, this did nothing good. Gary had told his psychiatrist that as a teenager, he was having some conflicting feelings about his mom because at the time of her washing his genitals, he was also going through puberty.
When did you think about having sex with your mother?
When 14 or 15, I think.
Tell me about that. It's about the same time frame.
I'd see her out sunbathing, and I feel that she, she'd be good to have sex with, but she's my mother, and I never really. This is the only woman in my life, other than neighborhood girls, but so I'd get fantasies of having sex with her. And
he said he would go back and forth between anger and sexual attraction toward her because of this, and that he often fantasized about killing her.
You couldn't take your aggressions out on your mom.
No, I couldn't.
But you could think about it.
I could think about it, and
What'd you think?
I thought about hurting her, so she'd shut up and leave me alone, and then...
How did you think about hurting your mom?
Killing her.
And how would you do that?
I thought with my hands, or I didn't have no guns or anything, so...
Gary had his first victim at the age of 16. He tried to murder a little boy that was 6 years old. By the grace of God, he was unsuccessful this time, but he led him into the woods as he was playing and stabbed him through the ribs. Gary was never caught for this, and I think everyone knows that once you start getting away with stuff, it makes you feel untouchable.
I stabbed a kid one time.
Okay.
Stabbed a kid with a knife.
Tell me about that.
It was down by Chinook, where I used to go to school. And boy was playing. I stabbed him in the side and didn't kill him.
As chilling as it is, you guys, the 6-year-old boy that survived recalled Gary walking away saying, "I've always wondered what it would be like to kill someone." Gary claimed to have actually murdered his first victim when he was a teenager. He said that the two of them were swimming in a pool and he wrapped his legs around him and held him underwater until he drowned. Over the span of 20 years, Gary would methodically rape and strangle many, many women. And just like I told you guys earlier, most of them were either prostitutes or runaways. Then, after he was done with them, he would take their bodies and spread them out across a wide area of King County just to try to confuse the authorities. And confuse them it did, because look how long it took him to get caught. Investigators believe that throughout his murderous spree, Gary was a pretty mild-mannered man because he was able to maintain his longtime job at the Kenworth truck plant in Washington, and he had been married 3 times. The first person to tie the knot with Gary was Claudia Barrows, and the two got married in 1970, but it didn't last long. By 1972, him and Claudia had gotten a divorce due to infidelity while Gary was in the Navy, but not long after he divorced Claudia, he got married for the second time to a woman named Marcia, and the two of them had a baby in 1975 and named him Matthew. FYI, I try to find a picture of Matthew for you guys, but he seems to stay out of the public eye, and honestly, that's understandable.
Saying, I think ruse number 1, 2, 3 will work with this woman. Tell me, explain that process to me.
Well, one of them was, a woman would get in a car.
She's already in the car?
She's in the car. Let's say she's always in the car. We're driving down the road, and she wants to see my ID. So I whipped out my ID, and with my ID would be I'd put my finger over my driver's license to hide my name. Mm-hmm. But on the opposite side was pictures. And a picture of my son. And they would see my son, and they would know I was probably a normal person.
But you were really using your son as part of your ruse.
Because at the time I didn't want to picture my ex-wife there, so I had to have a picture of my son.
Marcia and Gary would get a divorce in May of 1981, but Gary still maintained a pretty good relationship with Matthew and was granted visitation rights after the divorce was settled. Shortly after Marcia left him, he was arrested for trying to choke a prostitute near an airport, and then in April of 1982, he was arrested for soliciting an undercover officer that was posing as a prostitute. So clearly, he was making himself known in that industry, and not in a good way by any means. Then comes 1985, when Gary started dating a woman named Judith Mawson, and in 1988, the two of them got married. That was his third marriage.
Always happy. His smile never changed. One for me.
Gary had always been a loving husband.
He made me feel like a newlywed every day.
Judith was good for Ridgway, though. In an interview a while back, Ridgway said that his relationship with her reduced his desire to kill, and he said that he was truly in love with her and felt less of a need to find sexual satisfaction elsewhere.
What do you remember?
I was in shock that day when I heard someone driving up in the driveway, and I couldn't believe it.
But now, let's get to the nasty, gruesome part. So Gary's murder spree started on July 15th, 1982, when the body of his first victim was found. It was a warm, sunny day in Seattle when children were outside playing and having a good time before they found a body floating in Seattle's Green River, which I'm sure you could guess is where his nickname came from. Can you guys imagine the way this probably scarred those children that found her, though? Ugh, it's so sickening. The body would later be identified as 16-year-old Wendy Caulfield, but it wouldn't stop there, of course. Over the next following weeks, 4 more bodies were discovered in or along the banks. But once again, it didn't stop there. On August 15th, 3 more bodies were found. Those 3 being 31-year-old Marcy Chapman, who was found in shallow water alongside the naked body of 17-year-old Cynthia Hines.
I strangled Cynthia Hines to death. Is that your statement, Mr. Ridgway?
Yes, it is.
Is it true?
And a little ways down from Cynthia was 16-year-old Opal Mills, who had blue pants knotted around her neck, her breasts were exposed, and she had apparent bruises on her arms and legs.
I strangled Opal Mills to death. Dolores L. Williams. I strangled Deborah Estes to death.
Yes.
There were nearly 100 relatives in court. They wept as the prosecutor read Ridgway's written confession.
On August 16, 1982, the authorities set up a task force in order to investigate the killings, and after they set up said task force, the body count rose. Over the next 2 years, the Green River Killer sexually assaulted and murdered more than 40 other women. But it wasn't until April 30th, 1983 that Gary would become a suspect, and he only became a suspect because in the spring, 18-year-old Marie Malvar, who was a prostitute as well, was last seen by her boyfriend getting into a paint-patched pickup truck with a dark-haired man that was about 30 to 40 years old. 4 days after she was seen getting in his truck, the authorities questioned Gary at his home, but he denied even knowing Marie. The authorities waited until November to question him again about the murders, but again, he denied any knowledge of the victims, and honestly, they just lacked evidence to connect him any other way, so they had to let him go. In May of 1984, Gary contacted the police offering his assistance, so the police went ahead and gave Gary a polygraph test because he was already a person of interest due to his known association with prostitutes, and guess what? He passed the polygraph test. The polygraph questioned him on if he had killed any of the women they found, and because he really had no emotions on it, he was able to pass with flying colors. As crazy as it sounds, Ted Bundy had read about the ongoing case in the press, so he decided to write Detective Reichert, who was lead detective at the time, offering him his help. And honestly, the authorities wasn't sure what else to do at this point, and they didn't want anyone else to fall victim to his acts, so they decided to take him up on that offer. Reichert flew down to Florida where Bundy was being held on death row, and during their discussions, Bundy apparently advised the authorities to leave the bodies alone and just watch them for a while because the killer may be revisiting the corpses in order to perform sexual acts on them. Now, because Gary was allegedly the last person seen with 2 of the victims, police eventually searched his home and vehicles in 1987.
Judith found a stash of condoms in the couple's garage. Detectives found more stuffed in the framework of Gary's pickup truck. And it gets worse. They tore Judith's car apart. The crime lab found traces of semen. Investigators told Judith Gary had probably used her car to pick up.
At the time, Gary finally provided the police with a sample of his saliva, but of course, at that time, DNA testing wasn't the greatest at all, so he remained a free man for more than a decade. In March of 2001, new technology in forensic testing came into play, so investigators took that chance to re-examine evidence from all the years the killer had been active. The forensic scientists said that they didn't have a lot to work with, but they combed through the evidence again as a last-ditch effort, which included rinsing all of the fingernails to look for trace evidence and swabbing the ligature for cellular material. She said that they actually got lucky because they were able to find a few sperm clinging on to one of the girl's pubic hair. So at that time, the new DNA profiles from 3 of the victims were compared with the saliva sample that Gary had provided in 1987, and it was a match in all 3 cases. Then came November 30th, 2001, almost 2 decades after the murder spree started. A King County sheriff announced that 52-year-old Gary Ridgway was arrested in connection with 4 of the Green River Killer's early victims, which included Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, Cynthia Hines, and Carol Ann Christensen, whose body was recovered in 1983. In order for Gary to be spared the death penalty, he agreed to a plea bargain. So in other words, for him to not be sentenced to death, he agreed to a full confession regarding the details of the murders and locations of the bodies. On November 5, 2003, Gary Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. He admitted that he killed most of his victims in his house or truck before he disposed of their bodies.
I killed most of them in my house near Military Road, and I killed a lot of them in my truck, not far from where I picked them up. I killed some of them outside. I remember leaving each woman's body in the place where she was found. Is that true?
Yes.
And he added in that in most cases, he didn't even know the victims' names.
It says here, I killed the 48 women listed in the state's second amended information. In most cases, when I murdered these women, I did not know their names. Most of the time, I killed them the first time I met them, and I do not have a good memory. It says here, I killed...
Gary was asked why he always chose runaways or prostitutes for his victims, and he said that they were easy to pick up without being noticed, and he knew that they might not ever be reported missing. Ultimately, his reason for picking up prostitutes was because he thought he could kill as many of them as he wanted to without getting caught. On December 18, 2003, a King County Superior Court judge sentenced Gary to 48 life sentences to be served consecutively with no possibility of parole. With that being said, we have reached the end of this video, guys. As always, thank you so much for watching all the way until the end. If you enjoyed this video, which I really hope you did, please don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave me a comment on a case you would like to see me cover in the future. Okay, love you, bye!